Alright, so I've got the parts. Hopefully we're going to have this done today. So what we have to do is do the same manner of disassembly we did for the other motor. Now obviously some of the parts for this I'm not going to swap over, like the camshaft. We're going to keep that for this one because it is original to this motor. Now on the flip side, but what we need to do is bring the piston rod cap down, and in order to do that it's going to be a lot easier. You just take the spark plug out. Alright, spark plug's out. Now we should turn and rotate this a little bit easier, which are a 5/16. Notice the last one. Now for these two bolts, I don't think it really matters which side they go in, but just for posterity, I am going to be sticking them back into the same side that they came out of when I go to reassemble everything. And the rod cap. There we go. So throw this back on the same way as well. And what we're going to do is push the piston as far forward as it can go. Just like that. And pull the crank out. And there we go. So you guys can see the new good shaft is a little bit longer than the old one. So what we're going to do is, before I reinstall the good used one, we're going to clean this up some. And by that I mean just give it a good wipe down, make sure all the sand's off of it. Because we are putting a new crankshaft in that's new to the motor, but what we use for reassembly is some of this stuff. It's great. And so this thing is really going to go back in the same way it came out. There's really nothing special to it. Just for the hell of it, we'll throw a little bit of lube on her. Lube up this part of the shaft a bit. And reinstall. And then I'm going to bring the piston back down. So now we can reinstall the cap, and that'll also get some of that lube mixed around and stuff. Here's our cap. Now what I'm going to do is essentially start these bolts both by hand, and I can feel the threads grabbing, so it's taking that piece of hardware. So that's snug, that one's snug. Now I've got to get the correct torque value and my torque wrench. So what we need to do now is figure out what exactly the number is that we torque both of these bolts to that hold the connecting rod cap to the connecting rod. This is very important that you get this correct. Now how you do this, and I've already looked it up off of the pull starter that's out there from the other motor, they're both the same motors minus the crankshaft, which is different. So I'm going to show you guys how to decode one of those. The model number for this particular motor that's outside is 10 M as in Mike 902. Now this is how you're going to figure this out. I strongly recommend you guys pick up one of these. They are very handy. You could probably find them online, but I like having a paper manual. So your first digit essentially is going to be your cubic inch displacement. This is the most important part for determining what your torque specification is going to be. So 10, we have a cubic inch displacement of 10 cubic inches. Not very big, is it? The M, as in Mike, is just a design series number. It's really nothing that's all that important. That's probably more for Briggs's end and what design iteration it is. Now we have 902. So we have 9, which identifies that. Anywhere from 5 to 9 is a vertical shaft, which it is. And then 0, plain bearing, non-flange mount. And 2, which is a rewind pull starter. Just for the sake of making things simple, these are the first 2 digits you're going to look at. So we are a 10, M as in Mike, 902. So over here, if I can get to the right page, connecting rod screw torque. So you find your particular model number, and it's not going to be exact, it's general, and it says it's 100 inch-pounds. This makes sense because they're 5/16. On the larger motors, they have a 3/8 inch bolt size, which are going to be a bigger torque value. But for all of these, you're going to have 100 inch-pounds. One of the things I really like about Briggs is they make their stuff fairly simple when it comes down to it. So this is the fun part, and that's orienting the hardware so you can get at it with the torque wrench. I've got it set to 100 inch-pounds. 2 clicks is industry standard, at least for aviation. So I'm happy with that. Now we just have to get onto the other bolt. And there we have it. So the piston rod cap is torqued down. Now we can get on to the next step. So now I'm throwing these tappets back in. And they're both the same. And now here is something that is very important, is lining up your camshaft correctly. You're probably going to have to wipe it off some, as there's a little bit of oil on it. But you'll notice that there is a, if I can get the camera to see it, small indentation that's actually right there in the gear set. I don't know if the camera can see this all that well because it's kind of hard to get an angle, but hopefully you can see it now. Just a very small indent right there. And that's what you're going to have to line up with this little mark that's right here on the gear. So again, it's not all that difficult. Just going to kind of have to finagle her back in and make sure everything's good. So there you have it. Next step. So we're just about ready to reinstall the sump back onto the motor, and probably should have cleaned up the underside of this a little bit. I've got the new gasket on in place. Now here is the governor unit. What's kind of interesting about this is on some Briggs models you have a thrust washer, and then you have your governor that sits on top of the cam gear. On some Briggs motors you have your governor that'll sit here and a type of locking spring or retainer that'll sit right there, and there'll be grooves for it. This motor doesn't have that. It's got kind of a newer design in that the sump kind of does that job for it, where it holds it in place so it's not going to really slip around all that much, and it more or less acts as, you know, kind of its pressure point. So to install this, all you have to do is grab your governor unit, but we're going to lube up this shaft. And this will hopefully make it a little bit easier to install the sump. Make sure not to get this stuff on your clothes if you're using this. In a pinch you can use motor oil, that'll work just alright. Now as I'm going to be bringing this down, you want to make sure that the governor stays on the little arm that's right here. You want it to be lined up just like that. And you want to make sure that does not move. So the camera's not going to be able to see it, but I'm going to be making sure that that's not going to give us any issue. And so with a lot of whacks with a hammer and a little bit of finesse, we've finally been able to get the sump lined up. So I'm just lining it up with the dowel pins now, pushing her down. And we're going to give her a couple more taps. And there you have that. So now we can reinstall the oil sump hardware and throw the seal in. So yet again, wipe the shaft down. And we can also make sure that the shaft itself is turning as it should and it's not binding up on the pan. So it appears to be fine. So what we're going to do now is throw our seal in place. And in order to do this, lube up the shaft with a little bit of tri-flow, as well as the inside where it's going to sit. And we're just going to bring it down just like this. We're going to very carefully kind of tap it into place. So I'll grab my other hammer here. All right, so very carefully. Probably have to get a punch, which is okay. As long as you're careful, there's no harm in using a big punch. You just want to be sure to not damage the seal. But you definitely don't want to use a sledge or a pointed punch. You're going to want to use one with a flat tip on the end of it, because a pointed one's going to go right through there and then you're going to have to pull everything off again. So here's our sump bolts. I'll throw these in. Actually, before I do that and get too far ahead of myself, probably put a little bit of a thread locker on here if I have some. So it's actually kind of recommended that you use this stuff. Even the manual tells you to do it. And you don't need much because the threads will kind of spread it around as you tighten them down. But you just want to get enough on there so it'll do what it needs to do when you tighten the bolts down. But this stuff is great. Been using this for years. Never had an issue with it. And the book is saying 120 inch-pounds. So it's not too far off what we already have. But what I'm going to do is do a little bit of cheating. I'm just going to quickly bottom these out. And then we'll torque them. So we'll set the torque wrench to 120. And I'm going to do a crisscross pattern. Okay, there's that one. That's 120 on all of them. Now what you can do is go through and check them all again. Make sure they're at the correct torque setting. If they are, you're done with that part. So the part we're at now is throwing the flywheel and all the outer accessories back onto the engine. We're going to throw the spark plug back in. You guys don't need to see this. I've already shown that initially, and there's really no difference. It all goes back on the same way. So after I get all that stuff back on, as well as the recoil, we'll see where we're going from there. I apologize if there's any wind. I can only do so much about that. But let's go ahead and see what happens. I also may have to adjust the governor a little bit. I'm not really too sure how much, but it might be something I'm going to have to do. Primer's working good, fresh gas. The blade is also out of balance as well, so again, there's not really any way around that without replacing the blade or balancing it. But like I said, I just wanted to use this as kind of a test bed, make sure it works, and it clearly does. So now I'm going to throw the air filter box and air filter back in and let it run for a little bit more and see what happens. You know, I'm not really all that surprised that this thing works, because after all, the only thing I really did to it was replace that sump gasket, the crank seal, and obviously the crankshaft. So if I remember correctly, this was a running motor. So in a nutshell, it kind of doesn't really surprise me too much that it runs, but it is kind of cool to see it working and running as it should. The screw is a little bent, obviously, but that's okay. So this thing might actually be okay. It might just need the blade balance, because the shaft is perfectly straight. All the residual assembly oil burned off. Still a little bit more that is, but that's nothing I don't expect. So overall, this thing works pretty good. We'll see what happens, and you guys will be updated. You all stay classy.